John Adams became the first Vice President of the United States in 1789, a role he famously described as the most insignificant office. Serving under George Washington, Adams found the position lacking in power but filled with ceremonial duties. A lawyer and revolutionary thinker, Adams had already been instrumental in American independence and diplomacy, and he assumed the vice presidency as a respected figure. While he had little direct influence on legislation, he presided over the Senate and cast 29 tie-breaking votes, still a record. Adams used his time as VP to stay visible in public life, paving the way for his own presidential ambitions. His frustration with the office shaped how future VPs would view the role. Though he often felt sidelined, his experience at the heart of the new federal government gave him insight and connections that would serve him later. Adams's vice presidency wasn't dramatic, but it was foundational in establishing the boundaries and limitations of the role.
Thomas Jefferson served as vice president under John Adams from 1797 to 1801, despite being his political rival. The two had faced off in a bitterly contested election, where Jefferson, as the runner-up in the Electoral College, was automatically made VP under the original rules of the Constitution. A staunch Democratic Republican, Jefferson fundamentally disagreed with Adams's Federalist policies, leading to a uniquely tense administration. Rather than act as a close advisor, Jefferson distanced himself from executive duties and focused on his role as president of the Senate. During this time, he quietly worked to organize opposition to Adams' policies, especially the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which Jefferson viewed as unconstitutional. His vice presidency functioned more like a campaign in waiting. By the end of the term, Jefferson had become the figurehead of a growing political movement and defeated Adams in the next election. His time as VP remains a case study in how the office can serve as a platform for ideological opposition.
Aaron Burr became vice president in 1801 after one of the most chaotic elections in American history. Tied with Thomas Jefferson in the Electoral College, Burr had technically earned just as many votes, throwing the election to the House of Representatives. While Jefferson eventually prevailed, Burr's failure to step aside gracefully damaged his political reputation from the outset. As vice president, Burr found himself sidelined by Jefferson, who never fully trusted him. Still, Burr made a lasting impact as president of the Senate, where he was praised for his impartial and effective leadership. His most infamous moment came after his term, when he killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, a shocking act that effectively ended his political career and made him a symbol of personal ambition gone too far. Though Burr's vice presidency was brief and politically strained, it is remembered for the drama surrounding both his rise to the office and his spectacular fall from grace. He remains one of the most controversial figures ever to hold the position.
George Clinton became vice president in 1805 under Thomas Jefferson, and later continued in the same role under James Madison, making him the first person to serve under two different presidents. A Revolutionary War general and longtime governor of New York, Clinton was already a seasoned political heavyweight when he entered national office. But his transition to the vice presidency marked a shift from power to obscurity. Jefferson largely ignored Clinton's input, and while Clinton initially supported Jeffersonian ideals, he grew increasingly disillusioned, especially during Jefferson's second term. His dissatisfaction only deepened under Madison. Clinton opposed the rechartering of the National Bank and took a harder stance on states' rights, sometimes clashing with Madison's broader Federalist tendencies. Despite these tensions, Clinton remained in office, though age and declining health limited his effectiveness. In 1812, while still serving as vice president, he became the first to pass away while holding the office, an event that raised early questions about the succession process. Clinton's vice presidency was historically significant not just for its longevity, but for demonstrating the limits of the role when a president chooses not to rely on their second-in-command. Though once a towering figure in New York politics, Clinton's national legacy is quieter, shaped less by action and more by his unusual two-president tenure and the early constitutional ambiguity surrounding vice presidential duties.
Elbridge Gerry became vice president under James Madison in 1813 after a long and complex political career that included being a signer of the Declaration of Independence and an early governor of Massachusetts. Though he had spent decades in politics, Gerry is often remembered today more for the term gerrymandering, named after a redistricting scheme approved during his governorship, than for his time as vice president. When he took the office at age 68, he was already in fragile health and came into a presidency consumed by the War of 1812. Madison didn't rely heavily on Gerry for policy or military strategy, and like many of his predecessors, Gerry found the vice presidency to be largely ceremonial. However, he remained loyal to the administration and was a firm supporter of Madison's war efforts, even as public opinion remained divided. He presided over the Senate with a sense of duty and decorum, despite ongoing political battles. In 1814, just over a year into his term, Gerry passed away while still in office, making him the second vice president in a row to do so. His passing again highlighted the constitutional gray area surrounding vice presidential vacancies and succession. Gerry's impact as VP was limited by circumstance and health, but his career as a patriot, legislator, and defender of Republican principles had already left its mark on American political development long before he took national office.
Daniel D. Tompkins became vice president in 1817, serving under James Monroe during what would later be called the Era of Good Feelings. A former governor of New York, Tompkins had played a key role in organizing the state's military defenses during the War of 1812, often using his own credit and personal funds when the federal government fell short. While his wartime dedication won him admiration, the financial strain haunted him for the rest of his life. When he became vice president, Tompkins was already deeply in debt and in declining health, both physical and mental. Monroe, though respectful of his service, kept him at a distance. Tompkins rarely presided over the Senate, and his attendance was so erratic that it became a political liability. His reputation suffered from persistent rumors of alcoholism, and his credibility diminished in Washington circles. Behind the scenes, he struggled to be reimbursed for the money he had spent during the war, which he saw not only as a personal injustice, but as a matter of honor. That battle consumed much of his time and energy as vice president. Despite these struggles, Tompkins was reelected along with Monroe in 1820, although even then he played little role in the administration. He passed away just a few years after leaving office, largely forgotten by the political elite. Tompkins' story is a sobering example of how personal sacrifice in service to the country can be followed by isolation, hardship, and neglect, even at the highest levels of government.
John C. Calhoun assumed the vice presidency in 1825 under John Quincy Adams, later continuing in the role with Andrew Jackson, making him one of only two people to serve as vice president under two different presidents. A brilliant but polarizing figure from South Carolina, Calhoun entered national politics as a war hawk and defender of American nationalism. Yet, over time, he became a fierce advocate for states' rights and Southern interests, especially regarding tariffs and slavery. His tenure under Adams was relatively stable, though marked by growing divisions within the administration. But it was during Jackson's presidency that Calhoun's vice presidency reached a breaking point. Their relationship soured over several issues, most notably the nullification crisis. Calhoun supported South Carolina's claim that it could nullify federal tariffs, a position that directly challenged Jackson's authority and the unity of the federal government. Tensions also flared over personal disputes, including the Petticoat Affair, which further eroded trust between the two men. By 1832, the political rift had become irreparable. Calhoun resigned from the vice presidency, becoming the first to do so voluntarily. He then returned to the Senate to continue championing the Southern cause. Calhoun's legacy as vice president is complicated. He was one of the most intellectually formidable figures to hold the office, yet his views contributed significantly to the ideological divide that would eventually lead to the Civil War. His vice presidency proved that even a powerful mind could find little satisfaction in a role so often defined by silence and constraint.
Martin Van Buren became vice president in 1833 after playing a key role in organizing Andrew Jackson's political machine, which laid the foundation for the modern Democratic Party. As Secretary of State and later Minister to the United Kingdom, Van Buren had already gained Jackson's trust, and his loyalty during bitter partisan struggles earned him the nickname the Little Magician. When Calhoun resigned, Jackson turned to Van Buren as his preferred successor, not just as a running mate, but as his political heir. Once elected, Van Buren's vice presidency was relatively uneventful in terms of legislative action, but it served as a carefully constructed stepping stone to the presidency. He avoided the internal scandals that had plagued his predecessor and used his time in office to solidify party loyalty and public confidence. Though he rarely presided over the Senate or made headlines, Van Buren's skill lay in the background, coordinating alliances, managing political narratives, and ensuring Jackson's agenda remained dominant. His calm and calculated presence offered balance to Jackson's more forceful style. In 1836, he successfully ran for president with Jackson's full backing, becoming the first sitting vice president since John Adams to be elected directly to the presidency. Van Buren's time as vice president highlights how the office, though often seen as passive, can be a powerful launchpad for those with the patience and political instincts to use it well. While others found the role frustrating, Van Buren turned it into a quiet campaign for the highest office in the land. Richard Mentor Johnson took office as vice president in 1837 under President Martin Van Buren, entering the role with an unusual combination of personal legend and political controversy. A Kentucky war hero who claimed to have killed Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames, Johnson carried frontier bravado into Washington, but never quite matched it with effective statesmanship. His nomination had been controversial from the start, so much so that no candidate for vice president received a majority in the Electoral College. For the first and only time in American history, the Senate was forced to elect the vice president, choosing Johnson in accordance with the 12th Amendment. Once in office, Johnson struggled to gain influence or respect. Van Buren rarely consulted him on policy, and Johnson's reputation suffered from his unconventional personal life, including his long-term relationship with an enslaved woman, scandalous by the standards of 19th century Washington. He spent much of his term away from the capital, managing his tavern and horse stable in Kentucky, and when he did attend Senate sessions, he made little legislative impact. His informal demeanor and lack of political finesse didn't endear him to elite circles. When Van Buren sought re-election in 1840, the Democratic Party dropped Johnson from the ticket, reflecting how marginalized he had become. Though his military exploits remained part of frontier lore, Johnson's vice presidency was marked by absenteeism and diminished influence. His story is a reminder that charisma and past glory don't always translate into effective leadership, especially in a role that demands quiet discipline and strategic presence.
John Tyler became vice president in 1841 after joining the Whig ticket as a Southern balance to the Northern war hero William Henry Harrison. The campaign slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," made him a household name, but few expected Tyler to wield much influence. He was chosen more for regional appeal than ideological alignment, and his views, especially his strict interpretation of states' rights, already clashed with the Whig leadership. When President Harrison unexpectedly passed away just a month into office, Tyler was thrust into the presidency, sparking a constitutional dilemma. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the presidency, but it was unclear if that meant he would become president or just act as one temporarily. Tyler settled the debate himself by taking the oath of office and insisting he was now president in full, a precedent that would later be codified in the 25th Amendment. However, his presidency was plagued by conflict. He vetoed key Whig legislation, leading to the mass resignation of his cabinet and his expulsion from the party that had elected him. Tyler's vice presidency was the shortest in history, but it changed the office forever. He turned a vague clause into an unambiguous principle. The vice president fully succeeds the president, no caveats. Though his presidency remains controversial, Tyler's insistence on legitimacy and continuity laid a foundation for peaceful transitions of power. His unexpected elevation gave the vice presidency new weight, revealing how quickly a symbolic role could become the most consequential position in the country.
George M. Dallas became vice president in 1845, serving under President James K. Polk during a presidency defined by expansion and ambition. A Pennsylvanian with diplomatic and legal credentials, Dallas had previously served as U.S. Minister to Russia and as a senator. Though not particularly close to Polk, Dallas was chosen to balance the ticket geographically and politically. His most notable act as vice president came early, when he cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate to lower tariffs, an issue that had deeply divided the Democratic Party. This decision boosted Polk's economic agenda, but alienated Dallas from his home state of Pennsylvania, where protective tariffs were popular among manufacturers. It would cost him any realistic shot at the presidency in future years. Despite his moment of influence, Dallas found the vice presidency confining and largely ceremonial. Polk, known for his solitary and controlling leadership style, rarely involved Dallas in executive decision-making. The vice president's primary public role remained presiding over the Senate, where Dallas performed his duties with dignity but left little lasting impact. His legacy is often overshadowed by the dramatic events of Polk's term, particularly the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the expansion of U.S. territory to the Pacific. Dallas never again held major office, and his post-vice presidential years were spent in diplomatic circles and private life. While his vote shaped trade policy for years to come, his experience underscores how even a vice president aligned with a powerful president can remain sidelined, serving in the shadow of national ambition with little say in the course it takes.
Millard Fillmore entered the vice presidency in 1849 alongside President Zachary Taylor, a war hero with little political experience. Fillmore, by contrast, was a career politician from New York with a reputation for administrative skill and party loyalty. He was added to the Whig ticket to appease Northern factions uneasy with Taylor's status as a Southern slaveholder. However, the two men had almost no personal rapport and barely communicated during their brief time in office together. Fillmore had little influence over Taylor's decisions, as the president relied more on his own inner circle of advisors. The Compromise of 1850, a series of bills aimed at easing sectional tensions, became the defining issue of the time. While Taylor initially opposed the compromise, his sudden passing in July 1850 changed everything. As vice president, Fillmore assumed the presidency and immediately reshaped national policy. He supported the compromise, including the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northern states to return escaped enslaved people to the South. Though this decision briefly calmed national tensions, it also damaged Fillmore's reputation in abolitionist circles and fractured the Whig Party further. His elevation to the presidency once again demonstrated the vice presidency's unexpected power in moments of transition. Fillmore's time in the role was unremarkable on the surface, but his rapid rise and policy shifts had lasting effects. He would later fail in a comeback attempt under a third-party banner, but his brief stint as vice president led directly to one of the most pivotal presidencies of the pre-Civil War era.
William R. King became vice president in 1853 after decades of steady political service, including time as a U.S. senator, diplomat, and long-serving ally to many administrations. He was elected alongside Franklin Pierce, a president chosen largely as a compromise candidate by a deeply divided Democratic Party. King was meant to bring experience, Southern balance, and party unity to the ticket. However, by the time of his inauguration, King was gravely ill with tuberculosis. So severe was his condition that Congress passed a special act allowing him to take the oath of office while abroad, making him the only U.S. vice president ever sworn in on foreign soil, in Cuba, where he had traveled in hopes the climate might improve his health. Unfortunately, the illness continued to worsen. He returned to the U.S. shortly after his inauguration, but was never able to assume active duties. Just 6 weeks into his term, he passed away, leaving the vice presidency vacant for the remainder of Pierce's term. King's vice presidency is the shortest in history among those formally inaugurated, and it is often overlooked because of his inability to serve. Yet his career prior to the office had been influential. He was a founder of the Alabama Democratic Party, had helped craft compromise legislation during previous sectional crises, and had served as minister to France. His passing left Pierce without a trusted second-in-command during a turbulent presidency. King's story reflects the fragility of the vice presidency in the 19th century, an office capable of enormous importance, but equally vulnerable to being sidelined by circumstance and ill health.
John C. Breckinridge became vice president in 1857 at just 36 years old, making him the youngest person ever to hold the office, a record that still stands. A gifted orator and rising star within the Democratic Party, Breckinridge was chosen to balance James Buchanan's ticket both geographically and generationally. Hailing from Kentucky, he symbolized a moderate Southern voice during a time when the nation was spiraling into sectional crisis. While he presided capably over the Senate, his time as vice president was overshadowed by the growing tensions between North and South. Buchanan's presidency saw the Dred Scott decision, violent clashes in Kansas, and rising hostility between political factions. Though Breckinridge attempted to stay above the fray, he couldn't escape it for long. In 1860, his political career took a dramatic turn when he ran for president as the Southern Democratic candidate after the party split over slavery. He finished second in the Electoral College, losing to Abraham Lincoln, but carried most of the South. When the Civil War broke out, Breckinridge chose to support the Confederacy, serving as a general in the Confederate Army and later as its final Secretary of War. This made him one of the few vice presidents in U.S. history to later take up arms against the government he once served. His trajectory from youthful leader to Confederate official underscores the deep fractures of the era. Once seen as a bridge between regions, Breckinridge instead became a symbol of division, his vice presidency marking the final chapter before the nation descended into war.
Hannibal Hamlin assumed the vice presidency in 1861 as Abraham Lincoln's first running mate, and his selection carried strategic weight. A former Democrat turned Republican, Hamlin hailed from Maine and was seen as a moderate abolitionist with broad appeal in the Northeast. His presence on the ticket helped balance Lincoln's more Western and pragmatic image with strong anti-slavery credentials from the East. However, Hamlin's tenure as vice president came during one of the most turbulent moments in American history, the beginning of the Civil War. While he supported the Union cause and backed Lincoln's major policies, Hamlin found himself largely sidelined from decision-making. Like many vice presidents of the era, his role was limited to presiding over the Senate, where he advocated for the war effort and emancipation, but rarely had direct access to the president's inner circle. Despite sharing Lincoln's general values, Hamlin's influence remained distant. In 1864, Lincoln chose to replace him on the ticket with Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat from Tennessee, to appeal more broadly to border states and showcase unity. This decision stunned Hamlin, who had expected to remain on the ticket during such a critical period. After leaving office, he continued to serve the country as a senator and diplomat, but never again held such a high-profile role. Hamlin's vice presidency is often overlooked, yet his steady loyalty during the Civil War's early years and his early opposition to slavery mark him as one of the more principled and consistent figures of the time, even if history largely remembers his successor instead.
Andrew Johnson entered the vice presidency in 1865 under extraordinary political circumstances. A Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union, Johnson was selected by Abraham Lincoln to run on the National Union ticket in an effort to promote national unity as the Civil War neared its end. His inclusion was meant to signal bipartisan cooperation, bridging the deepening rift between North and South. But Johnson's tenure as vice president was remarkably brief, lasting just 6 weeks.
He made headlines for his disorganized and embarrassing performance during his inauguration, where he appeared confused and reportedly under the influence of alcohol. Though this episode was largely forgotten in the immediate celebration of Union victory, it cast early doubts about his suitability for higher office. Those doubts became critical after Lincoln's assassination, when Johnson suddenly became president. Thrust into leadership during the fragile beginning of Reconstruction, Johnson's policies soon clashed with those of the Republican-controlled Congress. He favored a more lenient approach to the defeated Southern states, vetoing major civil rights legislation and resisting efforts to reshape the post-war South. His vice presidency is best remembered not for what he did in the role, but for the chain of events it set in motion. Johnson would go on to become the first U.S. president to face impeachment, narrowly avoiding removal from office by a single vote. His rapid rise from war symbol to deeply divisive president remains one of the most dramatic in American political history. Johnson's vice presidency was short-lived, but its consequences rippled through the nation's most delicate political transformation.
Schuyler Colfax became vice president in 1869 during a moment of national optimism, serving alongside Ulysses S. Grant in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. A respected former Speaker of the House and longtime Republican from Indiana, Colfax had built a reputation as a reformer and staunch Unionist. He was chosen for the ticket in part to balance Grant's military fame with legislative experience. As vice president, Colfax remained active in political discourse, frequently using his position to promote Reconstruction policies and civil rights for formerly enslaved people. However, his term would later be overshadowed by scandal. Though initially viewed as a symbol of clean government, Colfax became entangled in the Credit Mobilier affair, a sweeping corruption scandal involving fraudulent railroad contracts and congressional bribery. Allegations emerged in 1872 implicating numerous lawmakers, including Colfax, in accepting cash and discounted stock. While Colfax denied any wrongdoing, the accusations tarnished his reputation. Grant chose not to run with him for a second term, and Colfax quietly exited national politics. Despite the controversy, he had played a visible role during one of the most transformational periods in American history. His fall from grace reflected the broader erosion of public trust during Reconstruction, when hopes for reform often collided with the realities of power and profit. Colfax's legacy remains complicated. An advocate for progressive causes who became linked with one of the era's most notorious political scandals. His story highlights how the vice presidency, even when elevated by noble ideals, is never immune to the weight of public scrutiny and ambition.
Henry Wilson took office as vice president in 1873 during Ulysses S. Grant's tumultuous second term. A self-made man from Massachusetts, Wilson had risen from humble beginnings as a shoemaker to become one of the Republican Party's most passionate advocates for abolition, civil rights, and Reconstruction. Known as a principled reformer and fierce opponent of slavery, he had served in both the House and Senate before joining Grant's ticket to restore credibility to an administration marred by corruption scandals. Wilson was respected in Congress for his integrity, and his selection was seen as a move to realign the administration with its earlier ideals. As vice president, he focused on advancing civil service reform and supporting equal rights legislation, but his time in the role was marked by increasing frustration with the moral compromises of national politics. Grant's second term saw continued public disillusionment, and Wilson struggled to influence policy in a meaningful way. Still, he remained a voice of conscience within the party and worked to keep the Republican agenda grounded in its original mission. Unfortunately, his health began to fail soon into his term. In 1875, while at the Capitol, Wilson suffered a stroke and passed away while still in office. Though his vice presidency was cut short, Wilson's long political career left a distinct mark on the Reconstruction era. He stood as one of the few post-war leaders whose reputation remained largely intact, remembered more for his devotion to justice and reform than the political missteps of the time. His brief tenure underscored how personal integrity doesn't always translate into influence, especially within a system swamped by competing agendas.
William A. Wheeler assumed the vice presidency in 1877 under Rutherford B. Hayes, following one of the most controversial elections in American history. The Hayes-Tilden election of 1876 had ended in a disputed electoral count and a behind-the-scenes political compromise. Wheeler, a low-profile but highly respected congressman from New York, was selected as a running mate for his reputation as a clean and honest politician, traits sorely needed at a time when public trust in government had been shaken by scandal. While Wheeler had little national name recognition, his personal integrity and reformist views made him an ideal partner for Hayes, who was promising a return to honest government. In office, Wheeler's role followed the standard mold of the 19th century vice presidency: quiet, largely ceremonial, and focused on presiding over the Senate. He avoided the limelight, but he was widely regarded as a stabilizing presence. Despite the limited scope of his official duties, Wheeler supported Hayes' efforts to end the military occupation of the South and to pursue moderate civil service reform. However, the end of Reconstruction, effectively sealed by the Hayes administration, came at great cost to Black Americans in the South, who were left increasingly vulnerable to disenfranchisement and violence. Wheeler did not shape that policy directly, but his time in office remains closely tied to that pivotal historical moment. After leaving the vice presidency, Wheeler retired from politics and faded from public life. Though rarely remembered today, his brief national service represents an era of political repair, when restoring public trust became the central goal, but deeper social justice remained elusive.
Chester A. Arthur became vice president in 1881 under President James A. Garfield, though the two men had little in common. Arthur was a product of the New York Republican political machine, closely aligned with Senator Roscoe Conkling and the powerful Stalwart faction, which favored patronage and opposed civil service reform. His appointment was largely a political concession, meant to balance the ticket between reform-minded and establishment Republicans. While Garfield represented a move toward government reform, Arthur symbolized entrenched political interests. Their relationship was distant, and Arthur remained on the political sidelines as vice president, largely fulfilling ceremonial duties and presiding over the Senate. But everything changed just months into the administration when Garfield was shot by a disgruntled office seeker and later passed away from complications. Arthur, long viewed as a party insider with little vision of his own, suddenly became president. Expectations were low, and many feared the worst. Yet to nearly everyone's surprise, Arthur underwent a striking transformation. As president, he distanced himself from the corrupt machine politics that had elevated him and shocked former allies by championing civil service reform. He signed the Pendleton Act into law, which laid the foundation for a professional federal workforce, and began modernizing the Navy. While his vice presidency was brief and largely unremarkable on its own, it marked the beginning of one of the most unexpected and dramatic political turnarounds in American history. Arthur's time as vice president may have been forgettable, but it set the stage for a presidency that defied expectations and reshaped how power could be used for reform instead of reward.
Thomas A. Hendricks served as vice president for just 8 months in 1885 under President Grover Cleveland, but his long political career and symbolic significance made his selection a notable one. A lifelong Democrat from Indiana, Hendricks had previously been governor, a U.S. senator, and the Democratic vice presidential nominee in 1876, alongside Samuel Tilden in the controversial election that ended Reconstruction. By the time Cleveland secured the presidency in 1884, Hendricks was seen as a figure of party unity, someone who could appeal to both Northern and Southern Democrats, as well as to older generations nostalgic for antebellum ideals. His inclusion on the ticket was strategic, aimed at bridging internal divisions within the party. Once in office, however, Hendricks' influence was minimal. He was already in declining health and lacked the energy or opportunity to shape the administration's agenda. His duties were largely ceremonial, presiding over the Senate with limited participation in executive matters. Still, his presence lent gravitas to Cleveland's first term, serving as a quiet reminder of the party's past struggles and its renewed foothold in national politics after decades of Republican dominance.
Hendricks passed away suddenly in November 1885, leaving the office of vice president vacant for the remainder of Cleveland's term. Though his vice presidency was fleeting, it underscored how much the role could be shaped by symbolism and electoral strategy rather than active governance. Hendricks remains one of the least active but most politically calculated vice presidents of the 19th century, a man whose quiet presence reflected both the limits and the potential of the office he briefly held.
Levi P. Morton entered the vice presidency in 1889 as part of President Benjamin Harrison's administration, representing the rising economic and political influence of the Gilded Age. A wealthy banker and diplomat from New York, Morton had served as minister to France, where he played a key role in laying the cornerstone of the Statue of Liberty, a symbolic moment of U.S.-French friendship. Chosen for the Republican ticket for his fundraising abilities and ties to big business, Morton brought financial clout and establishment credibility to the campaign. Once in office, however, he followed the traditional path of 19th century vice presidents, presiding over the Senate with minimal involvement in shaping national policy. While he was well-liked and dutiful in his ceremonial role, Morton steered clear of controversy and remained firmly within the boundaries of the office's limited authority. His tenure coincided with a period of rapid industrial growth, growing labor unrest, and expanding federal power. Yet Morton, ever the diplomat, stayed mostly above the political fray. He rarely challenged the administration and did not seek to build a distinct public profile. Despite his wealth and status, Morton maintained a reputation for affability and respectability, qualities that made him a safe choice, but not a dynamic one. After leaving office, he later served as governor of New York, but never returned to the national spotlight. His vice presidency exemplified the quiet, behind-the-scenes nature of the role in the late 1800s, defined less by bold initiatives and more by party loyalty and social decorum. Morton's legacy is one of calm stewardship during a turbulent economic and political transformation.
Adlai E. Stevenson became vice president in 1893 under President Grover Cleveland's second administration, bringing with him a background of steady party service and a reputation as a staunch Democratic loyalist. A former congressman and assistant postmaster general under Cleveland's first term, Stevenson had gained popularity among Southern and Western Democrats for his aggressive use of patronage, removing Republican postmasters and replacing them with party faithful. This made him a politically useful choice for the ticket, helping Cleveland shore up support across various Democratic factions. Once elected, Stevenson entered office during one of the most turbulent economic periods in American history, the Panic of 1893. This financial crisis led to widespread bank failures, unemployment, and social unrest, dominating the administration's agenda and deepening rifts within the Democratic Party itself. Stevenson largely stayed out of the economic debate, even as Cleveland championed the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, a divisive move that alienated many pro-silver Democrats. Though he presided over the Senate as required, Stevenson had little direct influence on national policy during his vice presidency. However, his name occasionally surfaced as a potential presidential candidate in later years, a reflection of his broad appeal among party traditionalists. Stevenson's role was mostly one of balance, to represent the older, patronage-driven faction of the party, while Cleveland leaned toward more conservative economic reform. Though the Stevenson-Cleveland partnership was never especially close, their ticket symbolized the increasingly difficult task of holding together a fragmented Democratic coalition during a time of social and economic upheaval. Stevenson left office with his reputation intact, but his political influence waning.
Garret A. Hobart assumed the vice presidency in 1897 under President William McKinley and quickly became one of the most influential figures ever to hold the office up to that time. A successful corporate lawyer and former Speaker of the New Jersey General Assembly, Hobart was selected for his deep ties to Republican business interests and his ability to balance McKinley's more reserved demeanor with warmth and political agility. What made Hobart's tenure stand out was the unusually close relationship he developed with McKinley, a rarity for vice presidents in that era. He served not just as a presiding officer of the Senate, but as a trusted advisor, political strategist, and informal liaison between the executive and legislative branches. Dubbed assistant president by some contemporaries, Hobart attended cabinet meetings, provided counsel on legislation, and even acted as a social and political bridge within the Republican Party. His charisma and affability helped McKinley navigate a divided Congress and a volatile economic recovery in the wake of the Panic of 1893. However, Hobart's promising trajectory was cut short when he fell seriously ill during his third year in office. He passed away in 1899, just months before the 1900 election cycle began. His passing not only brought an end to a uniquely active vice presidency, but also opened the door for Theodore Roosevelt to be nominated as McKinley's next running mate, a choice that would dramatically shape American politics in the coming years. Hobart's legacy lies in redefining what the office of the vice presidency could be, not just a passive placeholder, but a partner in governance whose influence could shape policy and political tone alike.